first, aren't you?
I'll be reading scripture, Matthew 6:25-33. Jesus teaches about worry. It says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more important than food, and the body more important than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store anything away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to his life? And why do you worry about clothes? See how the lilies of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, O you little of faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well."
Good morning. Over the next couple of weeks, we'll have a little bit of shuffling going on in the pulpit. Our family will be in Lubbock next weekend for James's graduation from Sunset, so Dawn will be preaching next Sunday morning, and then the following weekend is the high school graduation, so we'll be here. But then the weekend after that, Jen and I will be in Washington, D.C. for the National Forensics Tournament that she qualified for, so Dawn will be preaching again that following Sunday. So appreciate Dawn's willingness to step in and fill in. Dawn, don't forget to wait for the scripture reading before you get up here. Little piece of advice. I was just so excited to start, I couldn't wait, I guess. So we've been searching or searching for references to the kingdom in the scriptures and studying the kingdom as kind of our theme for the year. And this passage mentions, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So we're actually probably going to spend a little less time talking about the kingdom itself today than maybe some things that go into kind of preparing our hearts for the kingdom, or preparing our attitudes to be kingdom people as we think about some of these things. So you won't hear the word kingdom a lot, but these are all things that pertain to being kingdom people that we'll be discussing today. Our context for this passage that we read this morning is, it's of course found in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 and 6. And if you look back at the verses that come immediately before the passage that was read, if you'll back up there to verse 19, Jesus says there, "Do not lay up for yourself treasures upon earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And so Jesus here, in the context of that Sermon on the Mount, he's talked about so many things already up to this point, but now he's really getting to the heart of the attitude about what it means to be people who would follow him and put him first. And so here, store up for yourself treasures in heaven. Don't be focused on the here and now. Don't be focused on the immediate circumstances or situation in which you find yourself, but rather have a longer view of things, have an eternal view of things, and be thinking about what it means not just to get by in this life, not just what it means to go from day to day here, but think about what it means to be preparing ourselves for what comes next. And that really fits in with, one of the Sundays of each month that we've been talking about, with the idea of this kingdom being kind of a forerunner of the kingdom that we will experience once we transition from this life into the next. And so Jesus here kind of going right along with that and saying, there's something more important than the here and the now, the physical. And then he follows that in the next verse there, verses 22 and 23. He says, the lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? A metaphorical kind of symbolic way of saying, what are you searching for? What are you looking at? Are you looking at things that have an eternal perspective? Are you looking at things, are you focused on things that have an earthly, a physical perspective? And recently in a Wednesday night class, we talked about Jesus being the light, and we are the light of the world, but Jesus really is the light, and we have to reflect him, right? And so one of the things we talked about is not letting anything come in between us and Jesus, because when something comes between us and Jesus, that blocks his light, and we can't then reflect his light. And that's kind of similar to what he says here. If the eye is full of light, then that means you're looking at things that are more important than the here and now, the physical. But if your eye is full of darkness, that means you're focusing on the world. The world is where darkness exists. And so Jesus there uses that imagery of light and dark, of being blind and seeing, to help us remember where we need to focus in this life. And then he says, in verse 24, he says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And that word mammon there is wealth, but it's not just wealth. It's wealth that we have turned into an idol. It's wealth that we have allowed to become so important to us that it supplants God in his natural role as our God, and it places wealth there in his place. So Jesus there kind of, once again, getting to the heart of the matter that we need to not be focused on the physical, but rather focused on the spiritual, focused on that which is eternal, focused on that which really, really matters. And then we get to the verse that was read. We get to the part that we really want to study this morning. And that's where Jesus begins by saying, for this reason. And so for what reason? Well, the reason that he has just put forth, the reason that he has just stated. Focus on things that are eternal, not on things that are physical. Focus on that which is really important, not the things that are distractions from what is really important. Remember, go back and look again. Lay up for yourself treasures in heaven. That's what's most important, not the things that are on the earth. Is your eye full of light, or is it full of darkness? Are you looking at what's more important, or are you looking at what's less important? And then you can't serve two masters. Are you pursuing wealth, or are you pursuing God? For this reason. Because all of those things are very real components of the life in which we live. The distractions that are there for them back in those days are just as real for us today, that we could be distracted by wealth, or we could be distracted by fame, or by fortune, or by anything physical that would distract us from following after Christ. For this reason, I say to you. And that's where we began with our lesson then this morning. For this reason, I say to you. Well, one thing he says is do not be worried. Some translations say don't be anxious. But what are the things that Jesus says don't be worried about? He says don't be worried about life. Don't be worried about food. Don't be worried about clothing. Well, those are kind of the three big ones, aren't they? I mean, those are kind of the three major things. That's like life. I mean, that's, am I going to live, or am I going to die? Am I going to be healthy, or am I going to be sick? Am I going to be diseased, or am I going to be well? That's life. I'm not supposed to worry about that. What about food? Don't worry about food. And I mean, that's how we live. That's how we sustain ourselves. And there are places in the world where people on a daily basis don't know if they're going to have food that day or not. There are people, maybe even our own community, that don't know if they're going to have food from one day to the next. And Jesus says, don't worry about that. Don't worry about food. He says, don't worry about clothing. Now, wait a minute. We're commanded in Scriptures to dress modestly. I have to worry about being clothed. I have to worry that I have clothes. But Jesus says, don't worry about clothing. So I wonder where Jesus is going with this, because those are all important things. Those are all necessary things for us to be able to live and function, for us to be able to even carry out the things that Jesus wants us to do. If I don't have food, I can't serve him for very many days of that before I'm done. If I don't have health, I can't serve him for very long before that's over. And so what is Jesus really saying here to us when he says, don't be worried about these things? You know, Jesus emphasizes to his disciples the exact thing that he says here in the Sermon on the Mount. If you go to Matthew 10, verses 7 through 10, and we've talked about this recently in Bible class, but Jesus, as he's sending his disciples out on the limited commission, this is kind of their first time to go out on their own. They've been with Jesus, they've followed him, they've been in his close proximity all along as he's teaching them how to be members of this kingdom that he is talking about. And now Jesus says, you guys come here, I've got a job for you. And he sends them out on their own. And he tells them in Matthew 10, verses 7 through 10, he says, as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. Freely you receive, freely give. Do not acquire gold or silver or copper for your money belts, or a bag for your journey, or even 2 coats or sandals, or a staff, for the worker is worthy of his support. Jesus is sending them out to tell people about the kingdom, to say the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He's sending them out as representatives of his kingdom. And as he is sending them out to be those representatives, he tells them, don't worry about money. Don't worry about food. Don't worry about clothing. Just go out and do the work that I've assigned to you. And what is the lesson there for his disciples? What is the point that he's trying to make? The point that he's trying to make is that God will take care of you. God will provide. God will make sure that as you are going about doing his business, doing his work, that he will take care of what he needs to take care of to enable you to do the work that he has called you to do. Jesus emphasizes to his disciples the very thing that he wants us to understand as well, that if we are involved in the kingdom, if we are putting the kingdom first, that's the most important thing we can do. And in putting the kingdom first, God will provide. God will take care of us. There's an example I thought of in relation to this is that goes back into the Old Testament. 2 Kings chapter 5. We have the story of Naaman. And you remember Naaman was the commander of the army of the nation of Aram, the Arameans. He was a valiant warrior. He was trusted by his king. He was his king's most faithful advisor. But he was a leper. And so that limited what he was able to do, the contact that he was able to have. It, of course, put limitations on his health, and it shortened his life expectancy. So all of those things are wrapped up in that idea of just him being a leper. And so the story is of a captured Israelite child, a girl, that was then brought into Naaman's house to be basically his wife's servant, his wife's slave. And when the little girl learned of Naaman's leprosy, she lamented the fact that we're not in Samaria. If we were only in Samaria, then Naaman, my master, would be able to go to the prophet, and there the prophet would be able to heal him of his leprosy. And so when his wife heard that, and she made it known to Naaman, and Naaman went to his king, and he told him, I've heard word of a prophet in Israel that can cure me of my leprosy. And so the Aramean king sends a letter to the king of Israel, to Jehoram, and he says, here is my servant Naaman, cure him of his leprosy. And you could imagine Jehoram's angst at getting that letter. Jehoram didn't have the ability to cure anybody of leprosy. And so Jehoram tore his clothes. He said that the king of Aram is trying to lay a trap for me. He's trying to pick a fight with me, because when I can't do this, he's going to send his army in to wipe me out. And so the king tears his clothes, and then Elisha hears of it, and Elisha sends word to the king, why have you torn your clothes? And when Elisha learns of what has taken place, Elisha says, well, send him to me. I can cure him. So Naaman goes to Elisha's house, and Elisha doesn't even come out to him. Elisha sends a servant out to Naaman and tells Naaman, go and dip into Jordan 3 times and your leprosy, or 7 times, and your leprosy will be healed. And Naaman leaves in a rage. He's furious. You want me to go wash in that filthy river. We have better rivers in Damascus. We have better rivers in my home, and they haven't been able to wash me clean of leprosy. What makes you think this would work?" And so Naaman's servant calms him down and prevails upon him to go and try it. What have you got to lose? And Naaman goes and dips in the Jordan 7 times, and his leprosy is cured. He is cleansed. And so Naaman goes back to Elisha to offer him a reward. And he had brought wealth that was unimaginable in terms of what he was ready to provide for Elisha, what he was ready to reward him for what he had done. And when Naaman makes that offer, look at 2 Kings 5, verse 15. It says, "Behold now," this is Naaman's response, "Behold now, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So please take a present from your servant now." So what has this miracle shown Naaman? Naaman has come to the conclusion that God is real, that there is a God in Israel, and this God is a powerful God, and that he is able to perform miracles that are unimaginable, that are unbelievable when compared to the gods that he is used to, when the gods that he has served in his homeland. They couldn't have done this. And so now Naaman is praising God. That was the whole point, wasn't it? That was the whole reason for performing this miracle, to demonstrate who God is, to demonstrate God's power. And now Naaman wants to offer Elisha a reward. And in verse 16, Elisha replies, "As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will take nothing." See, Elisha knew it's not about money. It's not about the physical. It's not about what Naaman has laid out here for him to show him, to show him the splendor of the silver and the gold and the clothing that he brought to lavish upon Elisha. None of that matters. What matters is I serve God, and his name has been glorified by what took place here. And this gold and silver and clothing that you offer, that means nothing, because God is what's most important. That's all tied up there in Elisha's response. And so Naaman leaves, and you know the story that Gehazi, Elisha's servant, follows after Naaman, and he's incensed that Elisha would allow this pagan, this evil man, by his estimation, to go and not pay something for what has been done for him. And so Gehazi follows him, and he asks for a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing, and Naaman actually gives him 2 talents of silver and a change of clothing. And Gehazi takes it back to his house and hides it, and then he goes and appears before Elisha, and Elisha says, "What have you done?" And Gehazi lies and said, "I didn't go anywhere." And then read Elisha's response in verse 26. He said to him, "Did my heart not go with you when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Is it a time to receive money and to receive clothes, and olive groves, and vineyards, and sheep, and oxen, and male and female servants?" Now, wait a minute. What did Naaman give Gehazi? He gave him silver, and he gave him clothes. And now, boy, Elisha has blown this all out of proportion. Elisha has just taken this down a road that I don't know where he got this, because now he's talking about olive groves and vineyards and sheep and servants. Where was Gehazi's heart? What plans did Gehazi have with that money that he received from Naaman? You almost wonder if Elisha, as he's saying those words about olive groves and vineyards and sheep and oxen, if he's not painting the very mental image that was in Gehazi's mind as he's thinking about what he's going to use that money to purchase for himself. See, it wasn't enough for Gehazi to be a servant of the prophet of the Lord. It wasn't enough for Gehazi to be able to see one of the greatest miracles of the Old Testament take place. It wasn't enough for Gehazi to be a representative of God's kingdom. Gehazi wanted his own kingdom. He wanted his own sheep and oxen and groves and vineyards and servants. And so Gehazi's heart is revealed by the words of Elisha, that he had seen that wealth, that money, those possessions, and his heart had been turned away from following after God. And he had turned to following after stuff, after money. And Jesus here in Matthew chapter 6 says, "For this reason, Do not worry about the stuff. Do not worry about the money, the clothing, the food. Don't worry about those things. Let God take care of those things. You follow Him. You put His desires first. You put His purposes first. And you let God take care of those things. Gehazi got those things out of order, and because of it, he then bore Naaman's leprosy in his own body. We must put God first. We must put His kingdom first. Jesus, as an example, then says, He says, don't worry about these things. Don't worry about food and clothing and life. But rather, consider. He says consider. Some other translations may say observe or think about or something more modern, but consider. And then he lists two things. He says, look at the birds. Observe the lilies. And we think of this as being a part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus was kind of out in a remote area and the people were seated on the hillside or gathered around a place where Jesus had room to be able to address the crowds. And Jesus isn't just saying in your mind's eye, like we hear today, I can't say look at the birds because you can't see any birds. You have to think about them. But Jesus would have been able to point and say, look at the birds. He would have been able to gesture to the ground and say, observe the lilies. Do you see these flowers that are all around us right now? Jesus would have been able to point these things out as they're there gathered listening to His words, and He would have been able to point to him and say, do you see those birds? Do you see those flowers? Even Solomon was not as beautiful in all of his glory as these flowers are. Not one of these sparrows, not one of these birds can fall to the ground without my God, my Father, knowing. And He provides for them. He has clothed these flowers. He has given them their beauty. He has provided for the birds of the air. Do the birds of the air get up and worry about where their next meal is going to come from? No, they go out and they get their next meal that God has provided for them. And so Jesus here is pulling these things into their field of view to say, look, God cares for these things, and He cares more for you. He has a purpose for you that is far greater than any bird. He has a purpose for you that is far more important than any purpose of any flower that's growing in the field. And yet if He cares for these things, surely He will care for you as well. You know, this is the very picture of faith. Faith is not blind. We get accused sometimes as Christians of saying, oh, you just have a blind faith. You just blindly go and follow this God that you say you serve, and you don't have any idea what He's really like or who He really is. And that is offensive. If you understand faith, you know that faith is not blind. Faith is built on evidence. And Jesus here is building their faith by presenting to them evidence and saying, look at the flower, look at the birds. Do you see how God cares for them? God cares for you even more. And they could see the way that God cares for the flowers and the birds, and they understand that God cares for them more. Hebrews 11:1 says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. There is an element to faith in which, yes, I haven't seen it directly, I haven't seen it with my own eyeballs, but I've seen evidence that leads me to that conclusion. It is not a blind faith. Not blindly following a God that I don't know. I'm following a God by faith who has demonstrated who He is, who has made Himself known to us by what He has done for us. Jesus here is pointing that out to the people that are listening to Him. You know, we don't need to experience something firsthand to understand something about it. We've had tornadoes in the area recently, and some of us were talking before class this morning about Don Hasselman, and I know another family in Wichita that lost their house recently in the tornado in Andover. I've never been through that. I've never seen a tornado. I've never experienced one. I don't have to go through it to understand something about it. None of you need to stick your fingers into a router blade to understand something about it, because you know a guy who did that, and I can tell you all about it. You don't need to do it. I don't have to have a face-to-face encounter with God. I don't need to see a physical presence of God and have Him lay out for me all of the ways that He's going to bless my life and all of the opportunities that He's going to place before me in my life, so that I can understand exactly where I need to place my next step, so that I can understand exactly what decision I need to make next. Because God has given evidence of His compassion, of His power, of His mercy, of His grace, of His holiness. Just like He gave evidence through the flowers and through the birds, He has given us evidence of all of those things about His character. And we can choose to follow Him, not blindly, but we can choose to follow Him by a faith of conviction, and a faith that is built upon the evidence that He has given to us about the love that He has for us. He has demonstrated those things so many times through His encounters with others. He's demonstrated them through creation. He's demonstrated by keeping His promises. And He's demonstrated first and foremost through the cross. God has demonstrated that He is trustworthy and that we can follow Him and that we can put Him first. Jesus tells the people, look at the birds, observe the lilies. Put your faith in the one who provides even for the flowers and the birds, because if He provides for them, He loves you even more. And He will provide for you as well. Jesus then concludes by saying, seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. There's so much tied up in that we could unpack, but it comes down to this: thee before me. And I can't remember what preacher in my past said those words that stuck with me. I don't know if that was a Glenn Elliott or a Gary Witcher, or going back even further into my past somewhere else. I don't remember the first time I heard that thought, those words, but it rings true with this passage. Thee before me. Seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things, the life, the food, the clothing, all of these things will be taken care of. Maybe not in the way that I would imagine, maybe not in the way that I wish, maybe not even to an abundance. But He will provide for those things. Paul demonstrates this to us in 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6, beginning in verse 6. Paul says, but godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. But flee from these things, you man of God, and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. I think Paul here is saying the exact same thing that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, store up for yourself treasures in heaven. Take care of your eye where they're looking. Make sure that you're not blinded by things that are actual darkness, but pursue the light. Don't go after wealth, but rather serve the one true master, that's God. And for this reason, then, don't worry about food, clothing, and shelter. But instead, observe the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, and use those as a reminder of God's love for you, that He's going to provide those things for you. And instead of all of those other things that are distractions, seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. Put those things first. Paul says it in terms of pursue righteousness, goodness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. What does it mean to be people who seek God's kingdom first? Well, Paul defines it there for us. We put righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. We make those our pursuit. And we understand that God will provide for the rest. So our call to action then, Jesus says, so do not worry about tomorrow. You ever dealt with somebody who has a lot of worry, who has a lot of anxiety in their life? Have you ever spent some time talking to somebody who has a lot of anxiety, and then your advice to them is, don't worry? How far does that go? That's tough. That's just kind of like when James in his letter says, if you're talking to somebody who's hungry and you say to them, be warmed and be filled, and then you go on your way and you don't actually give them any food, they're not warmed or filled. And so for somebody who is worried about these things, for somebody who looks at life and worries about health and worries about money and worries about food, it's not enough for us as God's people just to say to them, don't worry, it'll be okay. And then to go about our way, to go on our way doing our own business and just taking care of our own needs. We have to provide an example like Jesus did with the birds and the lilies, and we have to provide evidence for them that God will provide, that what God will sustain them. And sometimes it's through us that God will do that sustaining. So do not worry about tomorrow. Colossians 2 verses 1 through 3. Paul wrote, "For I want you to know how great a struggle I have on your behalf and for those who are at Laodicea." Paul struggled. Not everything was easy for Paul. There were times that it was very difficult for Paul not to be distracted by the things that were going on around him, because the things going on around him very often meant that his life might end. He talked about shipwreck and beatings and hunger. And sometimes those things were very evident and very real in Paul's life. But he says, I have struggled on your behalf and for those who are at Laodicea and for all those who have not personally seen my face, that their hearts may be encouraged, having been knit together in love and attaining to all the wealth that comes from the full assurance of understanding, resulting in a true knowledge of God's mystery, that is, Christ himself, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Where are we storing up our treasure? Where are we finding our wealth? If we're looking forward in physical things, if we're looking for treasure on earth, we'll never be filled. But if our treasure, our wealth, if we're searching for those and finding those in Christ, then he can fill us. And he can give us the peace that we're looking for. So don't worry. Don't worry about physical. Put our efforts and our hearts, our time, all of our efforts into searching for Christ. And that's where we can be filled. If you have a need this morning, we want to help you with that. We want to offer you whatever assistance we can, whether it's physical or spiritual, whether it's prayer, whether it's whatever. We want you to know that we're here to help. And if you have any need, we want you to come while we stand and sing.